So this video is basically about how long can debt collectors pursue you, chase after you to collect on unpaid debt. So basically this is going to cover the statute of limitations, like how long they can take legal action against you before they've passed the statute of limitations. My information here is from a website called Credit Collections Canada. So the statute of limitations on Canadian debts. So these laws that I'm telling you about, these apply to Canadian debts within Canada. So the laws could be different in your local jurisdiction. So the federal and provincial governments have limitation acts which provide a limit on the time an unsecured debt can be perused by legal proceedings. If an unsecured debt is not collected or payments are not made on the unsecured debt within these time limits, then legal action cannot be taken by the creditor or a collection agency. Only admitting to the debt in writing or making payments of a debt resets the statute of limitations. So in British Columbia, the BC Limitation Act sets 6 years as the limit for debt. Alberta, the Alberta Limitations Act sets 2 years as the term, which is extended to 10 years if there is a judgment. Manitoba Limitation of Actions Act sets 6 years as the limit for debt. New Brunswick Limitation of Actions Act sets 6 years as the limit for debt. Newfoundland and Labrador Limitations Act sets 2 years as the limit for debt. They spelt Nunavut wrong, but the Nunavut Limitation of Actions Act sets 6 years as the limit for debt. Nova Scotia Limitation of Actions Act sets 6 years as the limit for debt. However, within 4 years of expiry of general limitation period, court may disallow the limitation period, having regard to circumstances of the case. Listed are enumerated factors to consider, including date of discovery of claim. Northwest Territories Limitation of Actions Act sets 6 years as the limit for debt. In Ontario, the Ontario Limitation Act of 2002 came into force on January 1st, 2004. It sets 2 years as the term. However, this limitation will be reinstated where the debtor acknowledges the debt or makes a partial payment towards the debt. If the debt default occurred prior to January 1st, 2004, the creditor will have 6 years to pursue the claim. However, if the default occurred after January 1st, 2004, then the creditor will just have the 2-year limit. PEI, statute of limitations, sets 6 years as the limit for debt. Quebec Civil Code of Quebec sets 3 years as the limit for debt. Saskatchewan, the Limitations Act, sets 2 years as the limit for debt. And in Yukon, Limitation of Actions Act sets 6 years as the limit for debt. Federally, Section 32 of the Crown Liability and Proceedings Act sets 6 years as the limit for debt. Consumers, however, must be careful when dealing with the statute of limitations regarding debts at the federal or provincial government level. These include student loans, child support, taxes, and alimony. In the event that a judgment has been filed against a consumer, limitations are still set of the time that judgment can be collected. It is also important to note that limitations can be reset. Limitations begin when a cause of action arises. This is typically the date of last activity or the date of last payment. Therefore, if you have a bad debt and you start making payments, the statute of limitations resets. Comments on this article are now closed as too many people were asking questions without actually reading the article. If you have been contacted by a collector and the debt is past the statute of limitations for your province, a collector cannot legally collect the debt unless you admit in writing that the debt is yours or you start making payments again. So basically, if you have a debt, depending on where you live in Canada, those are the statute of limitation limits. So outside of those, they can't take any legal action against you. And as far as dinging your credit file, hitting your credit record with negative information, they can only hit your credit file for 6 years from the time that the debt first the debt first became delinquent or went into default. They can hit your credit file for 6 years from that date. So, again, I'm making this video because I know that there are some people out there that are going through tough times that might have a hard time paying their debts. Some of those people, yes. Some of those people are just straight up irresponsible with money, and they just bit off way more than they could chew without thinking about how they're going to pay it back. But then there's also people that are very responsible with money and very budget conscious, who are living well within their means, but unfortunately circumstances might have changed, such as they might have gotten laid off from their job through no fault of their own. They might have gotten their hours at work reduced through no fault of their own, or they might have had to take a pay cut through no fault of their own. So there's all kinds of circumstances that can change your financial situation. And yes, if you're in a position to pay back debt, if you're able to pay it back, the right thing to do is to pay it back. However, if you're unable to pay it, you only have so much money per paycheck. You're only going to get so much money, and that money will only go so far. So obviously, if you have to pick and choose between expenses, you're going to pay the most important ones first. You're going to pay like your rent or your mortgage, your utility fees, your condo fees if you live in a condo, your property taxes if you happen to own your property or if you're mortgaging your property. Your grocery bill, you're going to pay for food. You got to pay for medical expenses, toiletries, transportation, all the essential stuff. And if you don't have money left over to pay, say, your credit card bills and your and loans and lines of credit, sometimes, that can put you in a bad situation. So, it is a good idea to pay your debt if you're able to. But if you're unable to pay your debts, hopefully this information is helpful to you. And I read somewhere, at least in Ontario, possibly right across Canada, collectors can call you for as long as they want. They can basically call you to the day you die until that debt is paid off. It's up to you how you deal with it. If you don't plan on paying back that debt because it's a stale debt that's gone past the statute of limitations and gone past the period that it can show up in your credit file for, then, just keep that in mind, that if you communicate with that creditor and you admit to having that debt, you acknowledge that debt, then the statute of limitations resets. So just keep that in mind, be very careful about what you say, or even better yet, don't bother answering your phone. If you see a phone number show up on your phone that you don't recognize, or it shows up as unknown or private caller, just don't bother answering your phone. I'm not telling people here to be irresponsible. All I'm just basically telling you is giving you information about the statute of limitations and some of the things that debt collectors are able to do. Like in one of my previous videos I made about your rights when dealing with debt collectors. Hopefully you find this information helpful.